really love this webinar format. I've actually attended one of these before, and I love that we can meet so many different people from around the world. And so today I'd like to, with my two student presenters, to talk to you about some issues that unite all of us. And this has to do with testing. All right. So I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint. Yes, I'm sorry. And I'm going to share it with you just a second. Let's share screen. There we go. All right. Can everybody see this?
Yes, sure.
All right. I'm not real great at PowerPoint, but I'm going to do my best. And here it is.
Great.
All right. So can everyone see the full screen?
Yes.
If you can't, and I hope that the chat bar is open so that people can signal if they have questions or whatever's going on. But the name of this particular presentation is What Theories Do Teachers Use When They Make Classroom Tests? And this is for our colleagues at Indelt. And we have here our email addresses. Hope that you will, not hesitate to contact any or all of us about questions that you might have after the presentation is over. All right. So second language testing is an emerging yet perennial subfield in applied linguistics. And it's these two things at once. It's emerging and it's also perennial. It's emerging because second language teachers and program administrators at all career stages always seem to need to learn how to do testing. When we're a teacher and we become an administrator, suddenly we have to learn new things about doing tests. Or when we change jobs, we may have new duties, we'll change jobs, and then we'll often take on new responsibilities. And who and what we teach changes, of course, just as teachers. And with those changes, we need new ideas for tests. So when we get a new job or we're working with a new learner population for us, we have to learn some new things about how to test their English ability in this case. But it's also emerging, but it's perennial because accountability will be with us always, no matter what we do as teachers or administrators. And also testing companies, coupled often with textbook publishers, they're always developing new products. And so we need to kind of understand what these testing companies are doing. And often if there's a textbook that's coupled to it, we need to know quite a bit about testing. We have to keep up on things. And so programs forget and then often rediscover ACTFL guidelines, or the guidelines themselves are updated. ACTFL is more of a big thing in the United States. Or programs and teachers know about CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, but may be more or less aware of whether or how to use CEFR descriptors to inspire test designs. All right. And then I think that Maya is going to take a couple of slides and talk to us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gorsuch, and thank you everybody to be here. These two slides are going to show you three kinds of tests. Maybe one you have been a victim of, and two are very common in your instruction. So the first one we're going to say is norm reference test, also known as NRT. And this is the one you should at any point in your life been exposed to. They're commonly known as standardized tests. And one example of this is the TOCFL. It's mainly NRT. These ones are used to compare students to a well-defined norming group. That is, the test is created based on a group of people or students. They are long and the content is unpredictable. We don't really know what we're going to be facing in these exams. And usually there's a question and there's a multiple choice where you can choose the answer. They're usually written by testing experts. There are big companies behind these massive tests, and they're used for admissions and placement decisions. So you are in masters and PhDs. So usually universities need to test your English, for example, and they use this NRTs to do so. The second, maybe you're more familiar with it because you have created them, or you have, I don't know, discussed with your co-workers about them, and their criterion reference tests. These are also known as classroom tests, teacher-made tests, or mastery tests. Those are the ones you make on a regular basis to test your students. They're used to compare learners to the knowledge, skills, and content in a course. So we have, on one hand, norm reference tests that are based on a norming group with certain characteristics. And we have CRTs that take as reference the content of a module in your course or a unit in a book. So you are testing what your students know or learn from that unit that you taught. They're usually short with multiple subtests, and they're often key to a specific course outcomes. And students know what they're going to be tested on, and they study for it, they get ready for it. So it's not unpredictable as NRTs. They're usually written by teachers working on their own. Everybody has at some point created a CRT, and they're used for diagnosis and achievement decisions. And the beautiful thing about CRTs is that you not only know what your students learn from your unit or the class, but you can also see what they're lacking, what they need to reinforce, or maybe what you need to change a little bit for them to get a better grasp of the unit. So this flows on both ways. There's a third one that is called performance test. I don't know if I can move it. Can you move, Dr. Greta Gorsuch, the third slide?
I will do my best. It's not moving forward for whatever reason.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe Ferret, could you give hosting back to me? There we go. Got it. We got it.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So the third slide is performance tests. That is kind of similar to teachers' made tests. But in this case, we're going to use a task to evaluate. So they're also known as role plays, simulations, class presentations, final projects, you name it. They function to rate students on scoring criteria of interest. And they use a task, as I said, and a scoring criteria. And you're going to see how students perform in a task, how they use the language. Well, there's a little note that says that there are some commercially produced performance tests, but they don't really, they're not really tailored to the need of the classroom. Part of the TOCFL test is a performance test, and that is the speaking section. And then locally written performance tests are used for diagnosis and achievement decisions, and they're written by teachers, often working alone. And also teachers are the ones that are raters there. So you create the task, you apply the task, you check how your students perform, and then you have a final scoring for them. So I have two questions. Well, they were supposed to be a surprise first question and then answer, but it's okay. We're going to have them like this. So what do you think? Which kind of test would you use to assess receptive skills, that is reading and listening, the ones that students get input from? And which test would you use to assess productive speaking and writing? So here, I'm going to show you the answer. You already know. If you want to write your answer in the message box, in the chat box, it would be great. But well, in the meantime, I'm going to tell you for timing reasons. So receptive skills, that is listening and reading, are seen as more easily tested with CRTs using a variety of item types. And performance tests might be best suited for testing speaking and writing, the productive skills, okay? And we have here some little concepts that better describe the three kinds of tests. So remember, comparing students, NRTs, student knowing, CRTs, students doing performance tests. Okay, so Dr. Gorsuch, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Maya. I appreciate it. All right. So often NRTs and commercially prepared performance tests, such as the ones that Maya gave us examples of, are very salient to us as educators. They're salient because they're associated with accountability. You know, did our students do did our program do as well as other programs, similar programs, that kind of accountability? And then also NRTs may be taken as exemplars of good testing because they're developed by experts and they seem scientific and quantitative above all. Also, the terms standardized and standards-based go far to shore up the legitimacy of such tests, even though these two things are very different concepts. And they're often constructed using well-known and also documented procedures that are based on the high-level theory of proficiency. And I'm going to get to what I mean by high level in just a second. It doesn't mean quality, it doesn't mean good, it just means a high-level theory of proficiency. And these NRTs have their uses, but they're suited primarily for admission or placement decisions. They have limited use to us as teachers in the classroom. And because of their design, which by design includes unpredictable content, they cannot be related to any given program or course. And thus they cannot be used for diagnosis or achievement decisions or to give feedback to learners relative to a specific course and how well they've done. Okay. So enter classroom tests that teachers make. So these are largely CRTs and also fairly often performance tests, as Maya said. So such tests don't get much attention from L2 testing researchers. And in fact, the book that we're going to talk about today a little bit is kind of the first to talk about completely about CRTs that teachers actually make and use. So such tests don't get much attention. Perhaps they're considered mundane, obligatory, idiosyncratic, even worse, unscientific. And perhaps they're simply, poor reflections of what professional test makers can do. And yet these kinds of tests, the CRTs and the performance tests that we make and use all the time, they're indispensable and they're an everyday feature of classroom life. And they're used to award grades, meaning achievement, and to give feedback to students and to inform instruction, which is the function of diagnosis. And I would argue that these tests are theory rich on multiple levels. They're theory rich. And so upon examination, they're informed by high and domain level theories and also low level teacher theory, which is actually contextual, deeply efficient, orderly, and adaptive. And I just have this weird photo. This is actually a previous student who makes her own yarn, but it really shows that a kind of metaphor, a visual image of the tests that teachers make and use on a daily basis. And these tests are very principled and they're very complex. And something that might help us understand this beautiful and orderly complexity of the tests that teachers make is when we look through a model of theories, it helps us understand a bit more about what these tests are and what they attempt to do. And I'm basing the rest of this discussion on what's called the HML model by Griffey 2012. HML stands for high, middle, and low. It's just an acronym. And it suggests 3 types of theories with different purposes and also scopes and also functions. So what they attempt to explain and then what they're intended to do. So we have high-level theories, we have middle-level theories or domain theories, and we have teacher theories or low or local theories. And so when we examine actual teacher-made tests, many draw from all 3 levels of theory, not only in their design, but also in the way that the test results are generated and then used by teachers to give feedback or whatever it is the teachers use the test scores for. And so what are these theories I'm talking about? You're going to recognize quite a few of these. So high-level theories are public, published, they're discussed, and they're abstract. That's not really intended to apply to a specific situation. They're intended to be pretty universal. And they establish fundamental and overt changes in theory and also practice in the field. They affect everything we do. And some examples are communicative competence, which is the theory of applied linguistics. Also proficiency theories, of which there are a couple. And also test validity models would be considered high-level theories. Then we have middle-level theories, and they're often public, published, also abstract. And they're used to motivate research agendas, and they focus on a particular domain of interest. So here are some examples: second language acquisition theories, anything Krashen talks about, anything Ellis talks about, for example. Automaticity theory, and the notion of explicit and procedural knowledge, deliberate practice theory, self-efficacy theory, and other theories. These are middle-level theories, okay? But then here's where it gets interesting. This is the complex, beautiful, and orderly part of theory, where we get to low-level theories. These are teacher theories. They're private, they're efficient, they're intuitive, and they're very goal-directed towards solving, the problem of classroom instruction and testing. It's a beautiful set of fluid, complex theories that teachers use to do their jobs. So such theories are concrete, and yet they're hard for the holder to explain or articulate, and they're usually bound to the local context. So low does not mean worthless or poor or incoherent. Okay. And now we're going to hear from Joseph.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Gorsuch. So can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So I wanted to take some time. I'm going to be introducing Dr. Anise Shaver's test, a speaking fluency test for intermediate level German using a rubric based on Greta's conversational maxims. So actually, if we go to the next slide, here I'll be introducing Shaver's German test. Shaver is a German professor at a small liberal arts college, and she wanted to create a test to test intermediate students' speaking abilities. But she noticed that there was problems with finding a rubric that could grade these students. And so she created this really interesting German test that I found extremely interesting. So I'm actually going to try to share my screen and go to the German test. Okay, great. So here is the test. When I first looked at this test, I should say that I was expecting to see questions lined out or something, but that's not what Shaver did. So Shaver gave the students, her group of about 10 students, these prompts that we'll find later down in the test at the beginning of the semester and told them that later on in the semester, they would be having tests over these prompts. These prompts aligned with the course objectives, and she intended for one to be used each unit. So each unit, she tells them 2 or 3 days before the test, we're going to have a test next week or whenever, and here is going to be the prompt. And she encourages students to work with these prompts and practice with their colleagues, work with the vocabulary, work with the grammar, and begin communicating with them. Then the students come to class, and for 20 to 40 minutes, she sits in the back, she introduces the prompt, and then she steps away and she allows the students to communicate. She states that she does at times have to step in to help the conversation flow and to encourage conversation if somebody is taking the conversation too much, and gives it back to another student, especially at the beginning of the semester. But throughout the test, Shaver's goal is to sit back and observe the students. Here's where it gets interesting though. Shaver created a rubric based off of the maxims below, Grice's 4 conversational maxims. So just as Dr. Gorsuch was saying, we see this really interesting interplay between middle level and low level theory, that Shaver believed this was the best way to test her students' speaking ability. So she created this rubric right here that focuses on the 4 maxims: the maximum of quantity, the maximum of relevance, the maximum of quality, and the maximum of manner. And then below each of these, she kind of explains what is her idea with this rubric. What does she mean when she says quantity? And for example, just with quantity, she means how many turns is each student taking? Are they speaking an appropriate amount? Are they responding? Are they able to respond when somebody speaks to them? So is there enough speech? And she lists it very simply: students contribute enough information to the discussion. So while watching this exam, this performance exam, just as Mayerly shared with us, she's sitting there and she's writing pluses and minuses next to each rubric for each student. And then after the class, she thinks back on the test and she grades the students based on this rubric. And one important note is Dr. Shaver does acknowledge that this type of grading needs to be completed within 24 hours so that it's still fresh in her memory. But there are some changes that she wants to implement, such as recordings and being able to get a second rater, which also we'll talk about later, plays into higher level theory. So if I go back to the PowerPoint, I think, okay. So yeah, if we see here, we see that this is an important test because she's stepping back and allowing the students to go forward, and she gives them the prompt early. So she exposes them to the material and gives them the opportunity to see what they're going to be working with. Here's a slide just showing the 4 maxims that I showed on the test itself. And then I think Dr. Gorsuch will take over from here.
Yes, if you could unshare your PowerPoint, Joseph.
Oh, yes.
Oops. Okay, here we go. We're getting there. One thing, thank you very much, Joseph. That was great. And also Maya, that was great as well. One thing that I should mention to you really quickly is that the 4 tests that we may have a limited time to talk about, one of them you can see is Shaver up at the top of the screen. So these 4 individuals contributed to a book, which we'll talk about a bit later. And basically they provided their test. They're foreign language teachers, but I consider, English to be just another foreign language. It's just a language that we have to test, right? And so what I did is in the book, each of these chapters that you can see on the screen actually contains the test in the original language, the L2, but there's also an English translation. And then there are very lengthy interviews, questionnaires for each of these individuals that this is the material that we're using to talk about these particular tests in this presentation. And so when Joseph was talking about, Shaver says this and she did this, that's because we have really important data from her through this lengthy questionnaire that queried teachers about not only their test design, but also their scoring practices with the test, which Joseph talked about a little bit, and also the use of the student scores. How do the student scores get used? All right, so jumping forward. And so we get back to this HML model and how we can use high, middle, and low-level theory to examine what this individual teacher has done with the test that she made, a performance test. And so in terms of Shaver, all right, so high-level theory, she actually talks about it. She doesn't call it high-level theory, but she talks about proficiency. And she actually says, students should be able to demonstrate proficiency in the 4 language skills, which is why she made this particular test. In the United States, for foreign language education, especially at the college level, we're going to have a lot of written tests, receptive type tests. So she was really keen to make a speaking test or performance test, so she could capture one of the 4 skills and listening. In terms of middle level theory, she is using Grice's conversational maxims, and she instantiated those into her rubric. She actually says that. And this is unusual. I have not yet seen a performance test made by a teacher working alone that makes this really direct use of middle level theory, which would be Grice's conversational maxims. Again, to review really quickly, the maxim of quantity, the maxim of relevance, the maxim of quality, maxim of manner. In this case, she's looking at clarity of the student's responses, including appropriate word choices, lack of ambiguity, appropriate register, and also consideration for the audience, their interlocutors. But then she's also operating out of teacher theory. According to her, she says, evaluating spoken language proficiency is difficult and often overly subjective because of the influence of factors such as pronunciation, grammar, and manner or affect that influence the evaluation. So she wanted to create a rubric that would force her and her learners to pay attention to quantity, quality, manner, not just, sweat over their grammar and pronunciation, and not pay attention to the people that are sitting across from them during this exam and with whom they're having a conversation. Okay. So there are basically 3 stages, I think, at which we have to think about teachers and tests that they make. One is the test design. So that was the previous slide right here. But then we also have to consider scoring the test and then to what use the scores are put. All right. So in terms of how she deals with high, middle, and low level theories in administering and actually scoring the test, there's a very important piece of information from her data. In terms of high level theory, she made sure that learners use the same topics and prompts in their meetings and were shown an array of possible prompts on the board and through email. So the students had used these prompts in class, and then they were shown an array of possible prompts. And then the scoring scales, which Joseph shared with us, were written in English for maximum learner comprehension. All of these things accord with test usefulness, which is one of Kunin's quadrants of test validity, which is a high-level theory. And I don't know if you're familiar with John Kunin, Anthony Kunin, but this is a very important aspect of test design. It's right up there with communicative competence. Shaver also taps into middle level theory in terms of how she administered this test. The teacher reduced learners' affective filter. She's coming right out of Krashen, and she quotes Krashen, by de-emphasizing grammar and vocabulary in the test scores. And then low level theory, she thinks that scores should help students see their problematic areas and direct them towards improvement. And this is something she's very concerned about with this local context. She thinks as a teacher, this will help students. Also, she scored the test twice out of a desire for fairness and accuracy. Once, while the learners were engaged in the classroom, she was sitting in the back, and then a second time after the test while recollecting more details of the discussion. And she did this within 24 hours. Okay. And then also using test scores is quite important. In terms of high-level theory, Shaver says that she aimed at generalizing test scores to get a picture of learners' oral proficiency and comparing her scoring criteria to her understanding of general ability, which is proficiency, another high-level theory of language use. I feel that the rubric adequately provides a picture of the oral language students are capable of producing. And then she says a group discussion would be more authentic than one-on-one situations, as many professors do. And that's what happens in the United States. They have this oral test and the students will go in and the student will talk to the professor. And she sees this as less authentic. And she is, again, very interested in generalizing learners' performances to her, under her understanding of the high-level theory of proficiency. And then in terms of low-level theory, she reports student scores within 24 hours to increase impact for students. She wants the students to have their performance fresh in their memory and then to see her feedback. All right. So I'm going to argue that high, middle, and low-level theories overlay each other in multiple decisions that teachers make to design, score, and use tests. So instead of a ball of yarn as a visual image for these beautiful tests that teachers make, here we have a beautiful dragon, origami dragon. And so in talking about this test contribution from Shaver and looking at it through the lens of high, middle, and low-level theory, I'm not trying to force what she says into specific categories. It's important to remember that there is overflow and interleaving in what teachers do when they design and use tests. And so here's some items to consider that kind of continue that idea. So to what extent are teachers and also testers conscious of their theories, whether they're high, middle, or low, right? So their commentaries following their tests in this book suggest that they are aware of their reasons for designing, scoring, and using their tests. Many do use high and middle level theory names and concepts and appear to use them with a great deal of clarity in their thinking. And actually, Dr. Kilikaya is one of the contributors to this book, and I strongly recommend that you look at his contribution. It's a very, very interesting contribution. It's an English test. So just as some examples really quickly, I'm sure we're going to run out of time and we want lots of time for questions. So one of the tests that I showed you on the previous slide is from Jessica Amaya. She says, I think the performance test subtest also captured functional knowledge since students had to write a letter where they had to organize the information accurately. And this was a CRT/performance test that she made for a Spanish language module that she created on a heroine of Colombia's history. And this is high-level theory, what she's talking about. This is communicative competence, functional knowledge, which is how utterances or sentences in texts are related to the communicative goals of language users. So she actually talks about functional knowledge. She knows about communicative competence. And then one of the other tests on the previous slide is from Irina Drigalenko, who's a Russian as a foreign language instructor. And she has a very interesting overlay of low and high level theory. And she's very fluid between them, even though she doesn't name them as such. And I cannot imitate her beautiful, lovely Russian accent. I'm just going to read it straight out. So in designing the scoring, which she was very concerned about, she used her test score to grade level logic for all tests given in the course. So every CRT she made was scored this way. She wanted to have 90 to 100 equaling an A, and so on and so forth. All her tests, every one she made, had a score range of 100 points in order to monitor learners' progress and to teach more effectively. So on designing the test, she added new test items to reflect new insights that she got from learners, from teaching the learners. She said with section 2-1 on food and drinks, caviar, of course. I started out with fewer items, but after reviewing the chapter before the test and seeing students' demonstration of successful verb usage in class, I decided to add more items to this section. She attributes this decision to wanting to match test items with students' possible levels of proficiency. So this first thing with all the tests being 100 points is clearly a low-level teacher theory where she wants the students to see where they are in terms of this thing of 100 and also for herself. But then she's very interested in this bottom statement about proficiency and changing the content of her test according to what she sees. This is also low-level proficiency in high gear. And this is amazing what she's done. And I'm going to argue again that teachers and testers, and I say teacher/tester because they're the same, right? Their reasoning is internally coherent and it impacts multiple levels of test design and test scoring and administering plans, and also the intended use of tests and test scores. And I'm pretty sure this photograph of this cat is in Turkey. So I wanted to honor Dr. Kilakaya for that.